So I have a pleasure to introduce Tim Stewart. Tim is highly experienced in testing, analytics and business intelligence. And today Tim will be talking about effective test design.
So yeah, I've been testing for probably about 10 years now, and I frequently find myself coming in and troubleshooting for people. And the biggest issue I find with people's test plans, beyond kind of not having a plan, is that they're not structuring their tests to get themselves clear results. And I've got a presentation today just to run through some basic ideas. I haven't got too long to go into this. It's normally a full day training course to explain some examples of the sort of things you need to think ahead of before you start your test plan, and on how to structure a test to get you a clear result. So, the most common issue people get with their experiments, their A/B testing, is it's not been successful. And you see a study saying sort of 7 out of 10 tests are not successful. They don't get the results that they're looking for. And really, this is the problem. They don't get the win they're aiming for. It's not found. It's not part of the plan. They've got big targets, and it just didn't do the job for them. But then we look at the tests that they say they've been doing, and we find that they're using tools that have made a copy change, a change of wording on the homepage, and they're expecting an epic win for revenue. They're expecting to see something on the bottom line, something they can detect right down at the bottom of the funnel, and they expect it to be applicable to all customers forever. We see people following best practice and putting security icons on the baskets, and working on the basis, the false hypothesis that everyone who's ever dropped out because they were slightly concerned about the security on that page is now reassured. No other factors to do with anything in the purchase process is going to prevent them from buying. Best practice should have given them a win. The common one, and I'm actually going to use buttons as an example later on, is button color. Quite often we will see button examples because they're simple to explain. But we're being led to believe that everyone who wasn't going to click at all suddenly likes the color so much that they're not only going to click, but they're going to buy now, they're going to download, they're going to sign up, whatever the business objective from that button is. And they're going to do so in unprecedented volumes. They're going to do so at a level that is high enough to be visible in the analytics or the measurement tool that you're using for that. So we get told, make big changes. If you're making small changes and misinterpreting results, let's make big changes. The problem with changing all the things is what worked. So if you do a big A/B test and you change everything on the page, homepage 1 versus homepage 2, what worked? What happens if some parts did work and some parts didn't? They'll find that you could find that they cancel each other out. You get no significance. Your tool can't split the difference. The metric that you're measuring against doesn't show the change in user behavior that you've prompted. Some things didn't work, some things annoyed. So you get no uplift, no net gain. But worse, you get no understanding. You don't understand why it didn't work, so you try again. You make the same mistake next time. You try homepage 2 versus homepage 1. And again, big change. It may work, it may not, but you don't understand how you got there. So, big changes and no clear plan. It's not going to succeed. You're going to have a big fail. Big changes are not big revenue. It's another myth that gets thrown around that if you don't make a big change, you won't see it on the bottom line. Whilst the two things are related, you can only see a big change in revenue from making a big change to the user behavior. A big change in a test just for the sake of making it big doesn't necessarily correlate to what you're trying to achieve. You may find that you annoy more people than you win from. So I may be Captain Obvious here, but we find that we quite often set an unrealistic goal. We're expecting to get every question answered with one test. We put too much into a test. We don't think about how that test would actually produce the results we want. So I may be exaggerating, but these are the sort of claims that you'll see in blog posts and in people's test hypotheses. This is what they will give as justification for running a test. We wanted to do this thing, therefore we invented a reason to do so, and we didn't get a clear result. So I generally tend to advise to break it down to something simpler. You can't test to find a win. You can only test to narrow down where the win is, and you can, if you're successful, identify where the win isn't. You can work out which parts of the page are positive and which parts of the page are negative, and so you don't end up combining them and cancelling each other out. So first off, you have to define your purpose, because you can't win unless you define what a win is. And a win does not mean massive revenue every test. A win means understanding better where more user change, more user behavior change can be found. So when we define success, we're really talking about how we can work out what we need from a test. Why are we testing? before we get into any designs, before we get into structuring the test at all, why are we even testing this page? Because if there isn't a clear reason to test for the business or to solve a UX problem for the user, how are you going to define success? How are you going to measure that? Unclear results come from unclear planning. If you haven't thought this through, if you haven't worked out how you're going to get the test result that you want that affects the business, how are you going to measure that? How are you going to come up with a design that will fit that brief? So before you even pick a test, before you get in there, think about the qualifying criteria. What will make up a test with no designs at all, with no big enough or small enough change? What do we want to achieve? Where are the changes to be made? Why? What data is giving us a reason to go there? And based on what need? What user qualitative or quantitative information is telling us that we need to pay attention here? Who's it aimed at? Which part of the audience? Frankly, which part of the internal business is moaning the most? And who will care? Are there enough of them to actually show against the background noise? When can we do this? Because timing is a factor. And when is this running? Because seasonality, because marketing campaigns may affect the data we've got available to be able to do so. And how is all this measured? How will this show in the metrics that we've defined for the test? And when we're talking about testing, we need to show a difference. So how much difference could be made? So before we've picked our pages, before we even think about how we could be prompting a reaction, we need to understand our baseline. We need to think that the change is measured against control. So what is the baseline against which we're measuring? How do users behave? What volatility is there? What standard deviation? When no change is being made, if it's just the control, how much variance you see between mobile, between new, returning? Because we're talking about opportunity selection. So quite often the test that we pick is a test that we want to do, not a test that's necessarily needed or is going to be clearest. So we might be looking at this area here and going, oh, we need to change this small part of the site because we feel it's important and we've got enough data to justify our time that we're going to spend on this. But if you're going to be measuring when this small change is on the back of a much bigger wave, when you're looking at a very little difference against a much bigger background noise, you're not going to get a clear result, not unless your tool or you are able to drill down to that level. So you need to consider, are we measuring a ripple against the tide? If we don't understand current user behavior, we don't understand what volumes we've got to measure against, how can we tell if we changed anything at all? And if you don't understand the signal to noise before you start planning the test, how will you know what to change? How will your test setup or the tool that you use be able to detect a difference? How much do you have to do? How big is a big change in the scenario you've given yourself? Because all too frequently, I will see big changes being reported, but they've narrowed it down so much that this is the effect they've got versus the larger wave. They've seen a ripple over a pebble. It's very accurate, but it's no use to the business at all. So we're talking about experiments. And really, we talk about scientific test design and we're talking about hypotheses. So in basic terms, we saw this behavior. We think that changing this thing on the page in the user journey will change that behavior. And we think that this will manifest itself. It will be demonstrated from a change in user behavior from this primary metric, this thing we can measure that is going to show that they have done something differently than they would have done otherwise. And we think this metric is appropriate. We have to justify why it's large enough and whether it's close enough to what we're actually changing. And we say, given our baseline, our understanding of those metrics, this will be reliable as a sample in terms of representing our audience properly within X weeks or X periods or sales cycles. And we expect an effect size, how big that change would be, how much measurable data we've got to play with, because we've done our baseline research and we know what the normal variance is, so we know how big we need to be above what the normal ripples or tide would be. So all this sounds like statistics, which frankly, looking at this sort of data, most people go on board. But these are the fundamentals of setting up a test. Before you even design one, you need to think about how can we measure something? Because that's what then dictates what you then put into your variance. So a reality check before we start on how to structure a test. Be realistic about what can be achieved with a test before you start planning it. Even the best don't get a result every time. Results focused does not mean the wins have to be huge, but they need to be big enough to be measured and they need to be clear enough to take actions that matter. Be realistic about what you can achieve, your ability on this. If you only understand the simple side of the maths, do simpler tests. Understanding what your testing tool can do, because some tools will give you very great detail and some won't. But if you can't use either of that, or the tool is not up to what you can do, you won't get a result regardless. Be realistic about the accuracy. some sort of fine detail revenue product mix testing might not be possible, either with your traffic, your tool, your understanding. You might not be able to split out the minutiae that makes a difference to the business. All you can do is just go, let's make more people satisfied, and work on the assumption that people getting through the process will increase our revenue at some point. So really, before we've even picked what we're going to be changing, we need to think about what our metrics are. The closest metric to the change in user behavior, that's what you want. Prompted by the variant design. So we're going to try and fit the hypothesis of we'd like this to happen because we're going to change this thing. Okay, well, what does this look like? Can we measure that? The change being made does affect that metric, but not by enough to matter. You won't get a result. If the change does not affect that metric, if they click on something else, not the thing you're measuring, it will never matter. You'll never show significance, true significance. You may only get type errors. So I'm going to finish off with a simple button example. And I kind of sneered earlier on saying, oh, button tests aren't really going to show much. But it's used as an example because it is a simple concept. But as we'll see, maybe it's not that simple. So quite often here, bigger button is better. There you go, bigger button. But a better example would be size has got an impact on click rate. That's really what we're trying to establish. And actually by picking only one size and only one size bigger, you've limited the test. You've limited how much you're going to learn from that. So a better test would be control, big, bigger, biggest. So you understand the range and you can work out as it reports how far is too far up that range in terms of performance. Because a small change, only slightly bigger button, may not get a reaction. A bigger change may get a reaction. Biggest change may actually be negative because it doesn't work in some scenarios. So that's a better structure because you'll be able to establish where that limit lies. Bigger button is better. We've gone with that idea. But what it's testing really is that size has got an impact on click rate, prominence, the visibility that you get from being bigger. Bigger in itself is not innately better. It just stands out more. But you bias the test by picking only one way. You've already gone, bigger is better. What you're trying to say is size has an effect on user behavior. So really, we're talking about prominence. So in some scenarios, we might find ourselves bringing something down in prominence. So adding something that's smaller. Because if we find that the smaller is less good than control and everything that's bigger is better than control, we've actually got double proof because we've got our counter hypothesis in place as well. So it's an alternative structure. Testing something smaller to get less clicks may make not little sense to people. But really, we're trying to prove the idea of prominence, and that's what we're going to learn from a test doing this. So therefore, we structure to more clearly answer that question. So, okay, I've used add to cart as an example here, but maybe that might be the best possible option if we were looking at remove from cart. We don't want people to take stuff out of there. We don't always test to increase prominence. We may want to reduce noise in some scenarios. So sometimes the best button is not actually a button. So we've gone with our idea of bigger is better. But we may make a design decision that, bigger button with the same size text just looks odd. So during the design process, we'll decide to make the text bigger. But actually, inadvertently, we've introduced another variable because we've changed our text size. So what was making the difference? Was it the size of the button and therefore increasing the white space and the legibility around the text that we already had? Or was it the prominence of the text on the button and actually the button size is immaterial? We haven't been able to do that properly because we hadn't structured to establish that. So a simple way to get a two-element example out of this, you might not have enough traffic to test all of those 8 permutations. Difference between text size, button sizes, it might be too small to measure. You might only have a small effect on test size. If the button's only slightly bigger, you'll only see a bigger effect when it's really large. So a compromise potentially could be your control on the left, standard size. We've got one that's bigger. We skip the one that's got only the small change. And then we test standard text size versus larger text size on our biggest button. This second concept is on the variant with the largest change because we are more likely to see a reaction on the one with the biggest change. So Andy talked earlier on about changing the wording on buttons. That can quite often mean the button has to grow to fit the wording in. But that sort of effect can be exaggerated. So you may have a message that you get away with when it's small, but is actually too intimidating when it's large. Imagine if this, instead of saying add to cart, said buy now or give me all your money. That would mean it wouldn't matter too much when it was small, but you shout that at somebody and it gets intimidating. So this is where you need to test the range of sizes, but also the other factors that you might unconsciously have introduced by doing so. You also need to consider context. So here we have a classic PDP template, product detail page. Here's the smallest, the control, versus the biggest with the biggest text. But when you look at it against the overall picture of the page, That's not as big a difference as when we just zoomed in on our original wireframes. So we need big changes because the elements aren't in isolation. There's other noise on the page we're trying to stand out from. And whilst we may be focused on this thing because it's what we're trying to measure, there may be a whole bunch of other factors that are affecting the ability to click that button beyond being able to see that button. For example, here we've got 3 drop downs you must complete before you're able to click that button. It could be that people are struggling on that most. This is why our initial baseline research to see why people aren't clicking, to understand what issues they're having, factors into it. But let's assume that we know that it's going to be the same across the board. That's not as big a change as we originally thought. We thought biggest. If we'd just gone with a slightly bigger button, would we even see a difference at this scale? So this is control versus biggest option. It's not that big a change. And it's less obvious. But you also need to consider devices. What was possibly big change on desktop or big enough on desktop may actually be over exaggerated on mobile. It may be that you've gone thumb friendly, but it may be it's dominating the page, or on some screens it may wrap down and move position, so you introduce a positional change you didn't intend. Could you be testing desktop biggest but on mobile too big? So on one device you have got the balance perfect, but on mobile too big. Once again, you end up with that conflict where you've got the two which are cancelling each other out, and the net effect will actually be not so clear. So what is your traffic split? Are you 50-50 mobile desktop? What's the relative click rate? If you've got 15% click rate on desktop and 2% on mobile, one's going to show a different reaction to the other because of the way the maths works at that size. Also consider the templates. We're talking about an add to cart button. On product detail page, it's the one call to action. What happens when you make that big change on a big panel like the PLP? On a product list page, is that just adding noise? So is this actually the biggest factor? Is filtering the biggest factor to how many people actually add from this page? Is it most sites I look at maybe 20-30% maybe add from the list page? Maybe if you've got a quick view, it's a bit more, but quite a lot of people will click into the product detail. But if we're including this in the page, or we're making an assumption that we can include this wherever add to cart button experiences, we've actually polluted our test with 2 very different motivations, 2 different parts of the buying cycle, and where the change we thought we were making on product detail page, because that's where we designed for, we've inadvertently done a very different test on the product list. So what I'm saying is, when you go through this, write this down. Do your wireframes before you've even started thinking about what you're going to design, like what colors, what words you're going to do. Put down what you're trying to achieve. Blueprint those changes. Show what it should look like, what change you're trying to effect. Take a closer look at the page and the templates you're likely to be firing against. Look at what else could happen. Is the change clear against that background? Could something else be clicked on completely? Could it be substitution rather than clicking on the main objective? Are you measuring that thing too? Would you have that as a way to measure in the test? Or are you going to record a fail on one metric but fail to see that there was a win on another? And have you all shown all the states the page can be in for that test? Are there different versions of the product detail page depending on whether you have to pick 2 or 3 items before you hit add to cart or not? Does it work in all use cases? What's that like on mobile? Write this stuff down, because you will need to check against it when you come to your conclusion to say, how close did we get to what we intended? Because if we didn't get close, we improve that for next time. So quick sense check. Is it important to you, to the customer, to how the page is intended to work? Is it visible? Is it something that stands out? There's no point messing around with the location of the social share buttons if they're below the fold and everybody clicks on the add to cart button. You get nobody scrolling down to that point. Does every user care about it equally? Is it something that's only appropriate to new users and not returning? Are you measuring reaction against the full sample with your tool, but how much noise have you got from users who are not going to see it, not going to care at all? They could be on a page being counted in test, but not appropriate to what you're changing. They're never going to show a reaction against that metric. So I tend to say every result is a win as long as you learn something. That sounds like a loser. We want money, we want to get big revenue, but really we want to avoid risk. We want to understand how our time and effort that is invested into testing is going to get the best return. So as long as we learn, actually we get better at that. So when you say we're results focused, we want to care about revenue. Well, I'm results focused because this builds towards an ability to pick your results from prior data to understand better how to achieve it repeatedly, which is how you get a big bottom line business changing difference, is you add these things up. And if you're focused on the bottom line bottom line is not just what you get in at the top, but it's also what you cost yourself during the process. And if you are repeatedly testing and getting failures, there is an opportunity cost there from not doing it properly the first time, and there is a time and a human cost from basically spending a lot of time repeating tests you could have avoided. So when we say you want to learn, actually what you can do is learn what you can do on this test, but a well-structured test will actually indicate that there may be value in the next one. So we gave the button example, and I threw in one variant to contrast with the larger text size. In that test, we'd understand which was the bigger effect, button size or text size. Because if text size made no difference at all, we won't bother about it next time. We can spend time on our roadmap. But if it made a big difference, then actually we may pursue a line of investigation about, well, how do we make sure the text stands out? Because the button itself was actually immaterial to the difference we made. What we're trying to do is to try and narrow the odds, use each test to plan as though we're going to have a follow-up test which will get us an even bigger result. You want to try and improve your percentage shots. You want to try and get test intelligence that leads you to a better result the next time. The planning part, what we're going to pick, why we're going to use this, and the testing part includes moves that get you closer. You put in variants that give you intel on how to get there next time. So in conclusion, last few bits. You need to plan your moves before you even start. Before you start designing, before you put pen to paper, mouse to design screen, think about where it's going to fit in the business. Think about how you could test the thing you want to change. You need to organize those puzzle pieces. You need to put together all the various parts about data that you've got, what you could change, how the different templates work, so that you can get something that works. And you may have to play around, see what fits, because you don't have all the opportunity that you need. You don't have all the traffic that you need. You may find that some of the things you'd like to test you can't include in this one. So you need to think about a test structure that has got one element being changed, and if you've got a conflicting element, maybe throw in a variant that will give you at least a sense check to make sure that you haven't made a mistake with that. You need to evolve your testing plans, so your ability to test. If you learn, you can improve. And if you measure, you can quantify this. A clear, successful test has got a purpose. What does it mean to the business? What will it change for the users? Because that's what we're going to measure. You will understand your metrics, the user behavior, the changes, the outcomes that relate to actually what's being changed. You'll understand how they compare to a baseline, because you need to understand the size and the type of effects you need to look for and you could expect from your testing, and therefore what sort of thing you need to design to provoke a reaction. So you can calculate the required size. I need to structure it. Change one thing, ideally. Change testing a range of things that follow that same hypothesis. You want to confirm your hypothesis by having multiple stabs at it. And if the thing that is the most extreme version is slightly better than the thing that's slightly less extreme, and the slightly better again, the thing that's only slightly extreme, and the small changes have only got very little difference to control, you've actually got more confirmation and less risk of a false positive, because effectively the whole test adds up to give you an answer you're trying to achieve. If you are going to change more than one thing, try and have a matching pair in the test. Try and have it so that if you've got something where you introduce a new variable, because you have to, because of the way the test works, because inadvertently you've increased the size of the message when you wanted to increase the size of the button, then have one where the size of the message is small. It may look stupid, but if it scores less well than the one that looks good, you've proved your points twice over. Reality. A test doesn't win by itself. You can't retire off the result of one test because what you learn from a test is where you were lacking. You don't fill in the hole. You can actually improve that again and again. But it will lead you to a better baseline, a better position to work from for the next set of tests, both in terms of a higher benchmark to beat, but also in terms of a higher understanding of what is required to change and how much you need to change it by to make that effect. A good test will show you what change has an effect and what doesn't. A better test shows you how to get a higher probability win next time. So, clear, structured experiment design, 60% of the time, works every time.